The champagne still buzzed in Terence Crawford's veins as he watched Maria slip out the back door of his Vegas penthouse, her cleaning supplies forgotten on the marble counter. 3 hours earlier, he'd knocked out Canelo in the 8th round, unified every belt that mattered, and now owned a piece of boxing immortality. But something about the way Maria's shoulders had trembled when she thought no one was looking made him push aside the celebration and follow her into the desert night. Her beat-up Honda Civic coughed to life in the parking garage, and Crawford found himself trailing her through the neon-washed streets in his Lamborghini, keeping his distance like some kind of stalker. The irony wasn't lost on him. The newly crowned, undisputed champion of the world, following his housekeeper at 2 in the morning because she'd been crying while folding his laundry. If you're watching this and feeling that same pull toward the unexpected, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And don't forget to smash that hype button because this story's about to take you somewhere you never saw coming. Trust me, you'll want to be part of this journey. Maria's car wheezed through increasingly rough neighborhoods, past shuttered convenience stores and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Crawford had grown up in North Omaha, knew poverty like an old sparring partner, but this felt different, more desperate, more final. Her brake lights flashed as she pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel called the Desert Rose, its pink neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, and Crawford could see her shoulders shaking again. When she finally got out, she moved like someone carrying invisible weight, each step deliberate and heavy. He parked 3 spaces away, engine off, watching through his tinted windows as she climbed the external staircase to room 237. The door opened before she could knock. A woman in her 60s appeared, gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing a faded floral nightgown. Even from this distance, Crawford could see the family resemblance, the same delicate bone structure, the same way of holding her head when worried. Maria's mother had to be. They embraced in the doorway, and the older woman's relief was palpable. She pulled Maria inside quickly, glancing around the parking lot first, and Crawford caught a glimpse of the room's interior. A single bed, a small table, medical equipment that looked expensive and out of place in the shabby surroundings. Crawford's phone buzzed with congratulatory texts from his team, his promoter, celebrities he barely knew. The boxing world wanted to celebrate with him, but he couldn't tear himself away from this window into Maria's real life. She'd worked for him for 2 years, always professional, always quiet, arriving early and leaving late without complaint. He'd never asked about her family, never wondered why she sometimes looked exhausted beyond what cleaning his penthouse should require. Through the thin motel walls, he could hear voices, Maria's soft Spanish mixing with her mother's more urgent tones. A man's voice joined them, older, weaker, interrupted by fits of coughing that made Crawford wince. The medical equipment made sense now, and so did Maria's extra shifts, her refusal to take time off even when he'd offered paid vacation. A pickup truck rumbled into the parking lot, and Crawford tensed as 3 men got out. They moved with the casual menace of people used to collecting debts, their leader checking a piece of paper against the room numbers. Crawford's hands found the door handle instinctively, but he forced himself to wait, to understand the situation before acting. The men climbed the stairs and knocked on 237 with the kind of authority that wasn't really asking permission. Maria opened the door, and even from his car, Crawford could see her spine straighten, her chin lift in defiance that reminded him of fighters who knew they were outmatched, but refused to go down easy. The conversation was brief and one-sided. The leader did most of the talking while Maria listened, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. When he finished, she nodded once and closed the door. The men didn't leave immediately. They stood on the walkway for another minute, making their presence felt, before returning to their truck and driving away. Crawford waited until their taillights disappeared before getting out of his car. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of desert sage and distant rain. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached 237, he could hear crying from inside, not just Maria, but her mother too, and underneath it all, the labored breathing of someone very sick. He knocked softly, and the crying stopped immediately. Footsteps approached the door, and he heard Maria's voice, cautious and tired. "Who is it?" "It's Crawford. Terence Crawford." Silence stretched between them like a held breath. The door opened slowly, revealing Maria's face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been shame. "Mr. Crawford, what are you doing here?" Behind her, he could see into the room now. An older man propped up in the bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, his skin the gray color of someone fighting a losing battle. Maria's mother stood beside him, protective and afraid. "I followed you," Crawford said simply. "I saw you crying tonight and I followed you." Maria's face crumpled, and she stepped aside to let him in. The room smelled of disinfectant and medicine, with an underlying sweetness that Crawford recognized from visiting his grandmother in her final days. The man in the bed, Maria's father clearly, watched him with eyes that held more dignity than his circumstances should have allowed. "Papa has cancer," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stage 4. The doctors say maybe 2 months, maybe less." Crawford looked around the room, at the expensive medical equipment that didn't belong in a place like this, at the prescription bottles lined up on the nightstand like soldiers, at the family photos taped to the mirror showing happier times. The math was brutal and simple. Maria was paying for her father's care with money she didn't have, in a place that barely qualified as shelter. "Those men who were just here," Crawford said. "What did they want?" Maria's mother spoke up in rapid Spanish, and Maria translated reluctantly. "She says I shouldn't tell you, that it's not your problem." "I'm making it my problem," Crawford said. "What did they want?" Maria sat down heavily in the room's single chair, suddenly looking older than her 35 years. "I borrowed money. For Papa's treatment. The insurance, it covers almost nothing, and the experimental drugs, they cost." She gestured helplessly. "I borrowed from people I shouldn't have borrowed from." "How much?" "40,000, but with interest it's more now. Much more." Crawford thought about the purse from tonight's fight. 8 figures, more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. 40,000 was what he'd paid for his watch, what he'd tip at a good restaurant. But for Maria, it was everything, and more than everything. "The men said I have 1 week," Maria continued. 1 week to pay, or they take the equipment. Without the oxygen, without the morphine pump. She couldn't finish the sentence. Crawford's father had died when he was young, and he'd spent years angry at the world for taking away the one person who'd believed in him unconditionally. Looking at Maria's father now, seeing the love in this family despite their circumstances, he felt that old anger transform into something else, a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with being human. "I'll take care of it," he said. Maria shook her head immediately. "No, Mr. Crawford, I can't accept that. I clean your house, that's all. You don't owe me anything." "You're wrong," Crawford said. "You've been taking care of my house for 2 years, making it a home, and I never once asked if you needed anything. I never saw you as anything more than the person who did my laundry and cleaned my floors. That's on me." He pulled out his phone and started making calls. His financial advisor first, then his lawyer, arranging transfers and payments that would happen before the sun came up. Maria tried to protest, but Crawford held up a hand. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is family taking care of family, and whether you like it or not, you're family now." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Crawford arranged for Maria's father to be transferred to a private room at Cedars-Sinai, with the best oncology team money could buy. He paid off the debt collectors with a wire transfer that made them disappear as quickly as they'd appeared. He set up a trust fund that would cover all medical expenses and provide for the family regardless of what happened. But more than the money, he stayed. He sat with Maria's father while the ambulance crew prepared him for transport, listening to stories about Maria as a little girl, about the dreams this family had carried across borders and through decades of struggle. He held Maria's mother's hand while she cried, understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a champion can do is simply be present. As dawn broke over Las Vegas, Crawford found himself in the back of an ambulance, riding with a family that had become his own in the span of a single night. Maria sat beside her father, holding his hand, and for the first time since Crawford had known her, she looked peaceful. "Why?" she asked him, as the city lights gave way to the pale morning sky. "Why would you do this for us?" Crawford thought about all the fights he'd won, all the belts he'd collected, all the moments of glory that had felt so important just hours before. None of them compared to this. to the simple act of showing up when someone needed him most. Because winning in the ring doesn't mean anything if you lose outside of it, he said. Because you taught me something tonight about what real strength looks like. Maria's father squeezed his daughter's hand and spoke in Spanish, his voice weak but clear. Maria translated, tears streaming down her face. He says thank you for seeing us. Really seeing us. Crawford nodded, understanding that this was the real victory. Not the championship belts or the money or the fame, but the moment when you choose to step outside your own world and into someone else's pain, armed with nothing but the willingness to help. The ambulance pulled into the hospital, and as they wheeled Maria's father toward his new room, Crawford made a silent promise. He would be there for every treatment, every setback, every small victory. He would learn their names, their stories, their dreams. He would remember that behind every person who serves you, there's a whole universe of love and struggle and hope. And maybe, if he was lucky, he would learn to be the kind of champion outside the ring that he'd always been inside it. Someone who fought not just for himself, but for the people who needed fighting for. As you watch this story unfold, I want you to think about the people in your own life who serve you quietly, who make your world better without asking for recognition. Maybe it's time to really see them, to ask their names, to understand their stories. Because sometimes the most important victories happen when the cameras are off and the crowds have gone home. In the quiet moments when we choose to be human first and everything else second.